Hey there, viewers. If you had the chance to ask Diddy one question during a lie detector test, what would it be? Drop your best question in the comments. I'm curious to see what you'd want to know. Now, let's get into this shocking story because what came out during this lie detector test will leave you absolutely speechless. Chapter 1. The Opportunity of a Lifetime. It wasn't my first time sitting across from someone powerful, but this felt different. My name doesn't matter. Let's just say I've spent years getting to the truth. Politicians, CEOs, even the occasional undercover operative who needed their cover blown. I've seen it all, and I like to think I'm good at what I do. But when I got the call to test Sean "Diddy" Combs, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The weight of the moment. This wasn't just another case. This was Sean Combs, Diddy, a titan of the music industry, a man who turned his name into a brand, his brand into an empire. People said he was untouchable, that his power ran deeper than the surface allegations. But sitting in a crumbling empire, facing charges of trafficking and abuse, even Diddy couldn't hide forever. I didn't know why they called me. Maybe it was because the investigators thought I could break through where others had failed. Or maybe they just needed someone who wouldn't be starstruck, someone who could sit across from him and treat him like anyone else. Either way, I knew this wasn't about routine questions or small lies. This was about the truth he'd spent decades burying. The moment I stepped into the jail, reality hit me. It wasn't a Hollywood depiction of a prison with echoing corridors and menacing guards. No, it was far more sterile. The walls were pale gray, the floors scuffed and dull, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, as if the place itself was tired. The interrogation room matched the rest of the facility. A metal table sat in the center, flanked by 2 chairs. The lie detector machine sat in the corner, quietly humming, its wires coiled neatly like a snake waiting to strike. There were no two-way mirrors or fancy surveillance cameras, just a single security officer stationed outside the door. I unpacked my equipment, checking and double-checking every wire and knob. Not that it needed checking. I'd done this hundreds of times, but there was something about this case that made me hyper-aware. This wasn't just about technical precision. This was about getting it right. Then I heard it. The sound of the door unlocking. A sharp metallic click, followed by the low creak of the hinges. I turned my head, and there he was. Sean "Diddy" Combs walked in, his presence filling the room before he even said a word. His shoulders were square, his chin slightly lifted, his eyes scanning everything like he was still in control. He wasn't. His hands were cuffed in front of him, a small but unmistakable reminder that no matter how powerful he had been, right now, he was just another He was wearing a plain beige jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and diamond-studded accessories he'd been known for. But even in prison clothes, he carried himself like he owned the room. He sat down slowly, his movements deliberate, like he was still trying to project control. "Nice setup," he said, nodding toward the machine. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. I couldn't tell if it was nerves or bravado, but it was clear he wasn't as relaxed as he wanted me to believe. I introduced myself and explained the process, keeping my tone neutral and professional. His responses were polite but clipped, like he didn't want to waste time on pleasantries. As I prepared the machine, I couldn't help but notice the tension in his body. It wasn't obvious, no fidgeting or dramatic gestures, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a stiffness in his shoulders. He was trying to act composed, but I'd seen this before. Beneath the surface, he was bracing himself. The room itself felt heavier with him in it. The hum of the machine seemed louder, the air more stifling. I adjusted the straps on his arm and chest, attaching the sensors that would pick up every subtle change in his body. "This won't hurt," I said, more for routine than reassurance. "Let's get it over with," he replied, his tone steady but low. The machine beeped softly as it calibrated, its lights flickering in rhythm with his heartbeat. I glanced at him, wondering what was going through his mind. Did he think he could outsmart the test? Did he think his charm or reputation would shield him? As the final sensor clicked into place, I leaned back in my chair and met his gaze. "Ready when you are," I said. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, and I pressed the button to start the test. In my career, I've seen people react to polygraphs in all kinds of ways. Some get defensive, others try to laugh it off, and a few break down before the first question is even asked. But Diddy was different. He sat there, perfectly still, like he was daring the machine to challenge him. But it wasn't just about him. It was about the truth that had been buried for years. Truths that were about to surface in ways neither of us could predict. I thought I knew what to expect. I thought I was prepared. But as the test began, I realized I had underestimated what this moment would become. This wasn't just another case. This was the beginning of something far bigger than I had imagined. Chapter 2. The Rules of the Game. The polygraph test isn't as dramatic as people think. There's no flashing red light that screams "Lee," or loud alarms blaring at every falsehood. It's all about subtleties, the small, involuntary changes in the body that betray the truth. As I prepared to start, I explained this to Diddy. This machine measures your physiological responses, your heart rate, your breathing, even your sweat. It's not about what you say, it's about how your body reacts when you say it, I told him. Diddy leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "So, it's like magic?" "Not magic," I replied calmly, "just science." He smirked at that, but it was the kind of smirk meant to hide nerves. I could see it in the way his fingers tapped against the metal table, just a faint rhythm he probably didn't even realize he was doing. "Here's how this works," I continued, keeping my tone steady. "I'll start with some control questions. These are simple, factual things to establish a baseline, things I already know the answers to. After that, we'll move to the real questions." "Sounds fair," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge of impatience. The machine was ready, its quiet hum filling the silence between us. I started with the basics, asking questions he couldn't lie about. "Is your name Sean Combs?" "Yes." "Were you born in Harlem, New York?" "Yes." "You currently in jail?" He paused for a fraction of a second before answering. "Yes." I glanced at the machine. The lines on the screen were steady, no spikes or dips. His body wasn't reacting. At least, not yet. "Good," I said, marking down the readings. "Now we have your baseline." Diddy looked at me, his lips curling into another smirk. "How'd I do?" "It's not about doing well or badly, it's about consistency," I said, keeping my voice neutral. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Man, you really don't give anything away, do you?" I ignored the comment and moved on. That's when his demeanor started to shift. At first, he seemed relaxed, answering routine questions without hesitation. His voice was steady, his breathing controlled, and the machine's readings confirmed it. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Not fear, exactly, but a quiet unease, like he was bracing himself for what was coming. "Do you understand how this machine works?" I asked, partly as a test and partly to keep the atmosphere neutral. I get it," he said casually. Then with a sly grin, he added, "But you really think it's foolproof?" "It's not foolproof," I replied. "It's about patterns. The machine doesn't decide anything, it just shows me what your body is saying." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. "And what if my body's just calm? What if I'm just not the nervous type?" It was a defense mechanism, plain and simple. He wasn't challenging me, he was challenging the process, trying to assert control. I'd seen it before, this need to turn the tables. It was what people did when they felt the walls closing in. "Then you've got nothing to worry about," I said, my tone as even as ever. He laughed, the sound short and sharp. "You're good," he said, shaking his head. "You don't rattle easy, huh?" I didn't respond. I knew better than to engage. This wasn't about me, and the moment I made it about me, he'd have the upper hand. The calm before the storm stretched on, each question building the foundation for what was to come. But even as we stuck to surface-level topics, I could feel the tension rising. "Are you the founder of Bad Boy Records?" "Yeah." "Did you win 3 Grammy Awards?" "I." "Have you worked with artists like Biggie Smalls and Faith Evans?" "Yeah." The answers were all true and the machine's readings were steady, but his voice had a slight edge now, like he was growing tired of the routine. "Are you guilty of the charges against you?" "No." For the first time, the machine registered a shift. It wasn't major, just a small spike in his heart rate and a slight irregularity in his breathing. But it was there. Diddy didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't let it show. His posture remained relaxed, his expression calm, but I made a note of it, knowing it was just the beginning. As the session progressed, his attempts to control the narrative became more apparent. He started cracking jokes, questioning the validity of the test, even throwing in the occasional compliment to disarm me. "You ever think about switching careers? You'd make a hell of a poker player," he said at one point, his tone light but probing. I gave a small smile, the kind that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm good where I am." He chuckled again, but it was forced, the kind of laugh meant to fill the silence. I could tell he was trying to maintain control, trying to keep the upper hand, but I'd seen this before. Calm on the surface, chaos underneath. It was only a matter of time before the cracks started to show. As I prepared to move on to the more serious questions, I glanced at him one last time. His smirk was still there, but his eyes told a different story. He wasn't as calm as he wanted me to think. Chapter 3: Cracks in the Armor. It was time to shift gears. The control questions had done their job, and Diddy was no longer smirking quite as much. Now it was about peeling back the layers, getting past the polished exterior to see what lay underneath. "Let's talk about your relationships in the industry," I said, keeping my voice steady. Diddy's shoulders tensed slightly just for a second before he relaxed again. "Relationships? What kind of relationships?" "Professional, personal, anything that's helped you maintain your position," I replied. He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I work with a lot of people. Always have. That's how you stay at the top." The words were smooth, rehearsed even, but the machine showed a slight change. His breathing was still controlled, but his heart rate had ticked up just enough to register. It was the first crack in the armor. I nodded, jotting down a quick note before continuing. "You've been described as a perfectionist, someone who doesn't take no for an answer. Would you say that's accurate?" He chuckled softly. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. I like things done right." "And when they're not?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Diddy's eyes narrowed slightly, his fingers tapping against the table again. "When they're not, I make sure they get fixed." The machine spiked ever so slightly, not enough to scream guilty, but enough to suggest there was more to his answer than he was letting on. I decided to push a little further. "Some people have said you've gone to extreme lengths to maintain control over your projects. Would you agree with that?" His smirk returned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Extreme lengths? That sounds dramatic. I just handle my business." "Handling your business?" I repeated, leaning forward slightly. "Can you give me an example of what that means?" Diddy's gaze shifted just for a second before he looked back at me. "It means making sure things get done, making sure people deliver. That's what this industry's about. Results." The machine didn't like that answer. His heart rate spiked and his breathing became slightly irregular. I marked it down, careful not to let my expression change. "Have you ever manipulated someone to get what you want?" I asked, keeping my tone even. His posture stiffened again, but he covered it with a shrug. "Everyone manipulates people. It's called negotiation. And in your negotiations, have you ever crossed the line?" He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. What line are we talking about? The line where negotiation becomes coercion. The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, Diddy seemed unsure of what to say. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Look, I'm a businessman. I do what I have to do to stay ahead. That's not a crime. But some might say it's unethical, I pressed. He scoffed, shaking his head. People love to throw that word around. It's just business. The machine spiked again. I didn't need the data to tell me he was holding something back. As the questions continued, the tension in the room became palpable. Diddy's answers grew slower, more measured, as if he was weighing each word before speaking. Let's talk about Bad Boy Records, I said. Your label has been a powerhouse for decades. How did you keep it running at the top for so long? His smirk returned, but it was thinner now, less confident. Hard work and talent. That's the formula. Nothing else? What else would there be? The machine spiked again. His heart rate was climbing now, and his breathing was becoming less steady. Let me rephrase, I said. Did you ever use intimidation or other tactics to maintain your dominance in the industry? Diddy leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Intimidation? Come on, man, I'm a businessman, not a mob boss. The words were casual, but his body language said otherwise. He was shifting in his seat now, crossing and uncrossing his arms, his fingers tapping against the table in a rhythm that seemed more anxious than deliberate. I made a note of it, keeping my expression neutral. So, you've never used your influence to silence someone who disagreed with you? His eyes narrowed, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then finally he said, People love to talk. Sometimes you've got to remind them of the truth. And how do you remind them? The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Diddy didn't answer right away. His fingers stopped tapping, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally he said, I don't need to explain myself to you. It was a subtle admission, but an admission nonetheless. I could feel the tension rising, the room growing heavier with every word. Let's move on, I said, giving him a brief reprieve. Do you regret any of the decisions you've made in your career? He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. Regret? No. I did what I had to do, even if it hurt people. Diddy's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. This is a tough business. People get hurt. That's just the way it is. The machine spiked again, and I made another note. Let's talk about specific incidents, I said, deciding it was time to up the stakes. There have been rumors about certain events, parties, deals, situations, where things may have gone too far. Do you know what I'm referring to? Diddy's posture stiffened, and for the first time, I saw a flash of genuine discomfort in his eyes. You're going to have to be more specific, he said, his voice low. All right, I said, leaning forward slightly. Let's talk about an event that allegedly took place in 2003, a party where multiple people claimed they felt coerced into actions they didn't agree to. Were you aware of what was happening that night? The silence that followed was deafening. Diddy's eyes stayed fixed on the table, his fingers twitching slightly. The machine's readings were erratic now, his heart rate spiking with every passing second. Finally, he looked up at me, his expression hard. I don't know what you're talking about. The machine disagreed. I decided to press further, my voice calm but unyielding. Multiple witnesses have come forward about that night. Some have described feeling threatened, others manipulated. Are you saying you had no involvement in that? Diddy's breathing was audible now, his chest rising and falling in uneven intervals. I told you, I don't know what you're talking about, Ed, and the machine is telling me otherwise, I replied. His gaze hardened, his hands clenching into fists. This is a setup, he muttered, more to himself than to me. I didn't respond. Instead, I let the silence stretch, watching as he shifted in his seat, his composure slipping further with every passing second. Let's take a break, I said finally, giving him a moment to collect himself. Diddy didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the table, his fists still clenched. The room felt different now. The confidence he'd walked in with was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. He wasn't untouchable anymore. He was human, vulnerable, and under scrutiny. I knew we were just scratching the surface, but I also knew the real test was yet to come. Chapter 4. The First Bombshell. The room was suffocating now, the air thick with the weight of unsaid words. Diddy's carefully controlled exterior was beginning to crack, and I knew this was the moment to push further. The machine was already telling me what his body wouldn't admit. There were secrets buried here, waiting to be dragged into the light. "Let's talk about the parties," I said, keeping my tone even. Diddy's head tilted slightly, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Parties? You know the ones I mean," I replied, my gaze steady. "The ones they call freak-offs?" The smirk faltered. It was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. His shoulders tensed, his fingers tapping that same nervous rhythm against the table. "People love to talk," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They blow things out of proportion. You know how it is." "Do they?" I asked, leaning forward slightly, because what I've heard doesn't sound like exaggeration. The room went still. For the first time, Diddy's gaze faltered, shifting to the machine before returning to me. "What exactly have you heard?" I didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch. It was a tactic I'd learned over years of doing this. People hated silence more than any question you could ask. It made them fill the void, often with more than they intended to share. Finally, I said, "I've heard about events where people were coerced into doing things they didn't want to do, where power and influence were used to keep people silent. Does that sound familiar to you?" Diddy's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't respond. Then he shrugged, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "Man, people will say anything to get attention. You can't believe everything you hear." The polygraph disagreed. The machine spiked sharply, the lines on the screen jagged and erratic. He was lying, and we both knew it. "Let's try that again," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Did you ever organize events where people felt coerced or exploited?" "At true parties," he said, his tone defensive. "Big parties, exclusive parties. People came because they wanted to be there." "And what happened at those parties?" Diddy's fingers stopped tapping. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What happens at any party? People drink, they dance, they have a good time." The machine spiked again. I pressed on, refusing to let him regain control of the conversation. "Witnesses have described these events as more than just parties. They've called them dangerous, even predatory. What do you say to that?" Diddy leaned forward, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "I say people love to throw stones. I say people love to take something good and twist it into something ugly. That's what I say." His voice was louder now, the calm facade slipping further with every word. The polygraph readings were all over the place, his body betraying the truth he was trying so hard to hide. "Were you aware of what was happening at these events?" I asked, my voice cutting through his outburst. He froze, the tension in his body palpable. "I threw parties," he repeated, but this time his voice was quieter, almost resigned. "That's all I did." "Did you ever witness anyone being coerced or exploited at these events?" The silence stretched again, heavier than before. Finally, he shook his head. "No, I didn't see anything like that." The machine spiked violently. His denial was weak, and he knew it. I decided to push harder. "Multiple witnesses have come forward describing incidents of coercion, exploitation, and even violence at these events. Are you saying they're all lying?" Diddy's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping to the table. "I don't know what people are saying. I wasn't responsible for what everyone did." "But you organized the events," I said, my tone unrelenting. You invited the guests, you controlled the environment, isn't that true? He looked up at me, his eyes hard. I threw parties, he said again, but this time there was no conviction in his voice. I didn't control what people did once they got there. The polygraph readings told a different story. His heart rate was spiking, his breathing erratic. He was lying, and he knew I knew it. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. Look, I didn't know everything that was happening, okay? I didn't know what people were doing behind closed doors. It wasn't a full confession, but it was the closest he'd come to admitting anything. I made a note of it, my mind racing as I processed the implications of his words. You're saying you were unaware of the darker activities at these events? Saying I didn't know everything, he replied, his tone defensive. I wasn't watching everyone's every move. And yet you benefited from the image those events created, I said, pressing him further. You built an empire on exclusivity, on power. Don't you think that comes with responsibility? Diddy didn't respond. His gaze dropped back to the table, his hands twitching slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. The weight of his words and his silences settled over the room. I realized we just uncovered a piece of the puzzle investigators had been chasing for years. It wasn't the full picture, not yet, but it was enough to suggest there was more to the story than he wanted to admit. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. He looked smaller now, his confidence eroded by the relentless march of the questions and the unforgiving truth of the polygraph. For all his power and influence, he was just a man, and one who was clearly haunted by the weight of his actions. But I wasn't done yet. Let's move on, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. There's something else I want to ask you about. Diddy looked up at me, his expression a mixture of defiance and resignation. What now? You've denied knowing the full extent of what happened at these events, but what about your role in creating the environment where these things could happen? What about the power dynamics you created? His jaw tightened again, his eyes narrowing as he stared at me. I can't control what people do, he said, his voice low. But you can control what you allow, I replied, and you allowed a lot. The silence that followed was deafening. Diddy didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the table as the weight of the conversation settled over him. I glanced at the machine, the jagged lines on the screen telling me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just about the events, it was about the choices he'd made, the systems he'd built, and the consequences he was now facing. As I prepared to move on to the next line of questioning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface. There were deeper truths buried here, darker secrets waiting to be uncovered. This was just the beginning. Chapter 5, The Shadows of the Past. The energy in the room was different now. The confidence that Diddy had brought in with him was all but gone, replaced by something heavier, something rawer. It was the weight of the truth pressing down on him, and I could feel it as much as he could. It was time to push deeper. The questions were no longer about parties or vague allegations. They were about specific incidents with names, dates, and witnesses. Let's talk about intimidation, I began, my tone calm but firm. It's been alleged that you've used your influence to silence people who could have spoken out against you. What do you have to say about that? Diddy's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at me. People love to make up stories, he said, his voice low but steady. The polygraph spiked. You're saying none of these allegations are true, I pressed. I'm saying people will do anything for attention, he replied, leaning back in his chair. But his posture was tense, his hands gripping the edges of the table. The machine disagreed. I leaned forward slightly, letting the silence hang between us. Let me be specific, I said finally. There are claims that you've paid off witnesses to keep them from testifying. Are you denying that? Diddy's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the metal. I have settled disputes, he said after a long pause. It's part of the business. Sometimes people want money and it's easier to pay them than to drag things out. The machine spiked again. Did you pay them off to keep them quiet? I asked, my voice cutting through the tension. I paid them to avoid drama, he said quickly, his tone defensive. Was it about avoiding drama or was it about avoiding the truth? Diddy didn't respond right away. His jaw clenched and he shifted in his seat, his body language betraying the discomfort he was trying so hard to hide. Finally, he said, I didn't force anyone to do anything. I just handled things the way I thought was best. The polygraph lines told a different story. I decided to press further. Let's talk about specific incidents. There's one in particular, an alleged incident in 2012 involving a former associate who claimed they were threatened after trying to expose certain activities. Were you involved in that? Diddy's breathing became audible now, his chest rising and falling in uneven intervals. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice tight. The associate claimed they received anonymous threats after speaking out. They said they believed those threats were connected to you. Are you saying that's not true? We don't control what other people do, he replied, but his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. The machine spiked violently. The tension in the room was palpable now, thick enough to cut with a knife. Diddy's composure was unraveling, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of the questions and the relentless truth of the polygraph. I decided to shift tactics, giving him just enough room to trip himself up. Why do you think these allegations keep coming up? I asked. If they're all false, why do so many people have the same stories? Diddy let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Because people are jealous. They see someone at the top and they want to tear them down. That's all this is. Do you really believe that? Yes, he said, but the machine spiked again. I watched him closely, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the table. His eyes were darting around the room now, unable to settle on one spot. For the first time, he looked cornered. Let's move on, I said, my voice calm but firm. There's another incident I want to ask you about. It involves a witness who claimed they were pressured to recant their testimony in a civil case against you. Were you involved in that? Diddy's eyes snapped back to me, his expression hard. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice sharp. The witness claimed they were approached by someone claiming to represent you. They were told their career would be over if they didn't change their story. Are you denying that? I didn't tell anyone to do that, he said quickly. Did you know about it? The silence that followed was deafening. Diddy's fingers twitched, his jaw tightening as he stared at the table. Finally, he said, I didn't know everything that was going on. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. The polygraph spiked again, the jagged lines on the screen betraying the truth he was trying so hard to bury. And then it happened. In a moment of desperation, Diddy blurted out a name that sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't the only one, he said, his voice low but charged with emotion. You think I'm the only one who did this? You think I'm the only one who knew? Who else knew? I asked, my voice sharp. He hesitated, his gaze darting toward the door as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then he muttered a name connected to the entertainment industry, someone with just as much influence and power as he once had. The room went silent. Even the hum of the polygraph machine seemed to fade into the background as I processed what he'd just said. The implications of that name were staggering. If what he was suggesting was true, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a network of power and influence, a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of everyone else. I stared at him, my mind racing. Are you saying they were involved? I am saying I wasn't the only one, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The polygraph spiked again, but I didn't need the machine to tell me he was telling the truth. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I leaned back in my chair, taking a deep breath as I tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't just about Diddy anymore. This was bigger, much bigger, and the ripple effects of what he'd just admitted could change everything. But I wasn't done yet. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Diddy sat hunched in his chair, his once relaxed demeanor now a distant memory. The air felt heavier with every second, pressing down on us both. He was sweating now, beads of it forming on his forehead and trickling down the side of his face. His hands trembled slightly as he rested them on the table, his knuckles pale from gripping the edges. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Every question I asked had been like a hammer chipping away at the walls he'd spent years building, and now the cracks were too big to ignore. I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. "Sean, let's talk about the incident in 2008. Diddy froze. His breathing, already uneven, grew shallow. His gaze flicked to the polygraph machine, then back to me. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you do," I replied. "It was one of the most publicized events of your career. Multiple witnesses have come forward describing the same thing, a party where coercion and intimidation were used to control the guests. Were you aware of what was happening that night?" He shook his head quickly, almost too quickly. "I didn't know anything about that. People lie. They make things up." The polygraph didn't agree. The lines on the screen spiked sharply, the jagged peaks and valleys painting a picture of the truth he was trying so desperately to hide. "Sean," I said, my tone softening slightly, "you need to understand something. The polygraph doesn't lie. It's not about what you say, it's about what your body says. And right now, your body is telling me that you know exactly what I'm talking about." His hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white. "I didn't force anyone to do anything," he muttered. "I'm not asking if you forced anyone," I replied. "I'm asking if you knew what was happening. Were you aware that people were being coerced that night?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the table, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The silence stretched on, the weight of it almost suffocating. Finally, he muttered, "I didn't see anything." The machine spiked again. "You didn't see anything," I repeated, my voice calm but firm. "But you knew, didn't you? You knew what was happening, and you didn't stop it." Diddy looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, anger, maybe both. "I didn't know everything," he said, his voice shaking. "But you knew enough," I pressed. "You knew enough to stop it, and you didn't. Why?" His gaze dropped back to the table, his fingers twitching slightly as he gripped the edge. "I don't know," he muttered. "You don't know?" I leaned forward, my voice cutting through the silence. "Or you don't want to admit it?" The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for his response. Finally, he said, "I didn't want to mess up the vibe." The words hung in the air, their weight suffocating. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. "You didn't want to mess up the vibe," I repeated, my voice low. "While people were being coerced, you were worried about the vibe." He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the table, his hands trembling slightly. "You understand what you're saying, don't you?" I asked. "You're admitting that you prioritized the success of the event over the well-being of the people there, is that right?" Diddy's jaw tightened, his breathing audible now. "I didn't force anyone," he said again, but his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. "But you let it happen," I said, my voice unwavering. "You created the environment, you set the tone, and you allowed it to happen. Do you take responsibility for that?" He didn't answer. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the faint hum of the polygraph machine and the rhythmic tapping of my pen against the table. Finally, he said, "I didn't think it would get out of hand." "And when it did?" I asked. Diddy's shoulders slumped slightly, his head dropping forward. "I didn't know what to do," he muttered. "You could have stopped it," I said. "You could have stepped in, called it off, made it clear that it wasn't acceptable. But you didn't." "Why not?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "Because I didn't think it was my problem," he said, his voice breaking slightly. I stared at him, the weight of his words settling over me. "It wasn't your problem," I repeated, my voice soft but firm. "But it was your party, your event, your environment. Don't you see how that makes it your responsibility?" He didn't respond. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. I decided to push further. "Sean, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Were you complicit in what happened that night?" His breathing hitched, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His hands trembled as he gripped the table, his knuckles white. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice shaking. "But you knew," I pressed. "You knew what was happening and you let it continue. That makes you complicit. Do you understand that?" His gaze dropped to the table, his shoulders slumping further. "I didn't want to get involved," he muttered. "But by not getting involved, you were involved," I said. "Do you see that?" He nodded slightly, his head hanging low. "Yeah," he muttered. The room fell silent again, the weight of his admission hanging in the air. I glanced at the polygraph machine, the jagged lines on the screen confirming what I already knew. He was telling the truth. But it wasn't just about the truth he'd admitted to, it was about the truth he hadn't said yet, the secrets still buried beneath the surface. I leaned forward, my voice soft but firm. "Sean, there's one more thing I need to ask you, one final question." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with exhaustion and defeat. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over me. "Do you feel remorse for what you've done?" His eyes widened slightly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, as he stared at me, his expression unreadable. The polygraph machine hummed softly, the lines on the screen still jagged and erratic. It was the only sound in the room, a quiet reminder of the truth we'd uncovered and the questions that still remained. As I waited for his answer, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led to this moment. The lies, the half-truths, the deflections. It had all been building to this, and now, here we were, at the breaking point. Whatever he said next would define everything. Chapter 7. The Final Question. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the polygraph machine. Diddy sat across from me, his head slightly bowed, his hands resting motionless on the table. The once confident man who had walked into this room was now a shadow of himself. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his own words, and his breathing, though shallow, was loud enough to fill the oppressive stillness. "Sean," I began softly, breaking the quiet. "Do you feel remorse for what you've done?" His reaction was immediate. His hands twitched, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. His breathing hitched, and his eyes darted up to meet mine. For a brief moment, they were wide and vulnerable, betraying the storm raging inside him. But just as quickly, his gaze hardened, and he leaned back in his chair as if trying to shield himself from the weight of the question. "I don't know what you mean," he said finally, his voice low and uneven. "You know exactly what I mean," I replied, my tone firm but not accusatory. "Everything we've talked about today, every decision you've made, every line you've crossed, do you regret any of it?" His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he let out a sharp breath, shaking his head slowly. "I regret some things," he muttered, the words barely audible. "What things?" I pressed gently. His hands twitched again, his fingers tapping against the table in an erratic rhythm. I regret trusting people I shouldn't have trusted, he said finally, his voice tight. I regret letting things get out of control. But do you regret your role in it? I asked. He flinched slightly, as though the question had physically struck him. His gaze dropped to the table, his breathing becoming more erratic. The polygraph machine registered sharp spikes, its jagged lines reflecting the turmoil he was trying so hard to suppress. I didn't want things to end up like this, he said after a long pause, his voice shaking. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. Yet people did. I said quietly. And you were at the center of it. Do you take responsibility for that? His jaw tightened and his fingers curled into fists. I didn't force anyone to do anything, he said, his voice rising slightly. But you allowed it to happen, I replied. You created the environment where it could happen. Do you take responsibility for that? The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on both of us. His breathing was ragged now, his chest rising and falling with each uneven breath. The polygraph machine hummed steadily, its lines jagged and chaotic. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, despair, and something that looked almost like guilt. I didn't know how to stop it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Didn't know how, I repeated, my tone soft but firm. Or didn't want to? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant point on the wall. You've spent years building an empire, I said, breaking the silence. An empire built on power, control, and influence. But now, it's all falling apart. Do you regret the way you built it? His eyes flicked back to me, and for a moment I saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. I regret I couldn't keep it together, he said, his voice trembling. That's not what I asked, I said gently. I'm asking if you regret the way you built it, the choices you made, the people you hurt. He closed his eyes briefly, his hands gripping the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he opened them again, his gaze was hollow, as though he was looking straight through me. I didn't have a choice, he said finally, his voice breaking. You don't understand what it's like, the pressure, the expectations. It's not as simple as you think. Maybe not, I admitted, but everyone has a choice, Sean. You made yours, and now you're here. Do you regret those choices? His breathing hitched again, and his hands trembled as he brought them up to cover his face. I don't know, he muttered, his voice muffled. You don't know, I pressed, or you don't want to admit it. I don't know what you want me to say, he snapped, his voice loud and filled with frustration. I want you to tell the truth, I said calmly. The room fell silent again, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. Diddy lowered his hands slowly, his gaze meeting mine. For the first time, there was no anger, no defiance, just exhaustion. The truth is, I don't know if I can regret it, he said quietly. Because it's who I am. It's what I had to do to survive. But at what cost? I asked. He didn't answer, his gaze dropping back to the table. I leaned back in my chair, watching him closely. His body language told me everything I needed to know. He was a man at the end of his rope, haunted by his own actions yet unwilling to fully own up to them. The polygraph machine continued its steady hum, its lines still erratic but beginning to settle. It was as though the machine itself could sense the weight of what had just been said, the truth and the half-truths mingling together in a tangled web. I took a deep breath, the heaviness of the moment settling over me. This wasn't just about the allegations or the confessions. It was about the man sitting in front of me, a man who had spent his life wielding power, only to find himself crushed under its weight. I glanced at the polygraph machine one last time, its reading steady now as Diddy sat in silence, his head bowed. Sean, I said finally, my voice soft. Do you think you deserve forgiveness? He looked up at me, his eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Hope? Despair? Maybe both. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I don't know if anyone can forgive me. I don't know if I can forgive myself." His words hung in the air, their weight suffocating. As I packed up the machine, the silence in the room was deafening. Diddy didn't say another word, and I didn't press him further. There was nothing left to say. As I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something profound, something raw and unfiltered. I had seen a man stripped of his power, his secrets laid bare, his defenses crumbling under the weight of his own guilt. But for all his admissions, there was one thing he hadn't said, one thing the polygraph couldn't measure. Remorse. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. Walking out of that room, I felt a mix of exhaustion and unease. The interrogation had ended, but the echoes of it stayed with me, reverberating in my mind like the hum of the polygraph machine. The man I'd faced wasn't the Sean Diddy Combs plastered across magazine covers or celebrated on red carpets. This was someone else entirely. Someone stripped of his bravado, sitting in the wreckage of his own making. As I packed up my equipment and left the facility, the weight of the day settled heavily on my shoulders. Every polygraph test is a battle, a tug-of-war between truth and deception. But this one was different. I had seen cracks in his armor that no headline could ever fully capture. For all his denials and half-admissions, Diddy had shown me a glimpse of the man behind the curtain, a man who was not invincible, but profoundly human in his flaws and fears. What stuck with me most was the look in his eyes during those final moments. It wasn't just exhaustion or anger. It was something deeper, something harder to define. Guilt, maybe. Regret, perhaps. But not remorse. Not once did he truly say he was sorry. Not to me, not to the people he hurt, not even to himself. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder if there was a part of him, buried beneath the layers of pride and self-preservation, that wanted to say it. The polygraph doesn't measure emotions, only physiological responses. But the way his voice shook, the way his hands trembled, the way his gaze faltered, it all pointed to a man carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. But what struck me even more than his reluctance to admit guilt was the world he described, an ecosystem of power, control, and silence. Diddy wasn't just a product of that world, he was its architect. The admissions he made, while vague and incomplete, painted a chilling picture. He didn't deny that things had happened at his events. He didn't deny that people had been hurt. What he did deny was responsibility, hiding behind excuses like, "I didn't know," or "it wasn't my problem." But even as he spoke those words, the polygraph screamed otherwise. Why? This was a man who had built his empire by mastering the art of influence, turning friends into allies, allies into pawns, and pawns into shields. He had cultivated a persona so untouchable that even when the walls began to crumble, he could still convince himself he wasn't to blame. And yet, for all his influence and control, here he was, sitting in a jail cell, shackled by the very power he once wielded. As I drove away from the facility, I couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. Diddy's story wasn't just about one man's rise and fall. It was a reflection of something far larger, a culture that rewards power without accountability, that celebrates success no matter the cost. The entertainment industry is built on images, on carefully constructed narratives that hide the darker truths lurking beneath the surface. It's a world where wealth and fame often come at the expense of others, where those at the top hold all the cards, and those at the bottom are left to pick up the pieces. Diddy's story was just one piece of that puzzle, but it was a significant one. For decades, he had been a symbol of success, of what could be achieved through talent, ambition, and relentless determination. But behind that image was a reality far more complicated, a reality filled with manipulation, exploitation, and the abuse of power. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many others there must be like him. How many other empires were built on the same foundation of silence and control? How many others had used their influence to protect themselves while leaving a trail of destruction in their wake? What haunted me most, though, were the lingering questions that I knew I might never get answers to. Would Diddy's admissions lead to justice? Would the people he hurt finally see accountability? Or would his influence continue to shield him from the consequences of his actions? And what about the name he'd dropped during the interrogation? That single revelation could ripple through the industry, exposing a network of complicity far bigger than any one man. But would it? Or would it be buried like so many other secrets, swept under the rug by those with too much to lose? These questions swirled in my mind as I tried to make sense of everything I'd witnessed. I'd spent years conducting polygraph tests, sitting across from liars and manipulators, but this felt different. This felt bigger. By the time I reached my office, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. I sat at my desk, staring at the notes I'd taken during the interrogation. Each line felt heavier than the last, a testament to the truths Diddy had tried so hard to bury. I thought about the people who had come forward, the ones who had risked everything to tell their stories. They weren't celebrities or moguls. They were ordinary people who had been caught in the crossfire of someone else's ambition. And for them, the stakes were far higher than a damaged reputation or a tarnished legacy. For them, this was about justice, about reclaiming something that had been taken from them. And yet, as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that justice might never come. Not fully, anyway. Diddy was just one man, and his empire was built on more than his own actions. It was built on a system that allowed those actions to go unchecked, that rewarded power over accountability and silence over truth. The polygraph test had been about more than just uncovering the truth. It had been about holding a mirror up to a man who had spent his life avoiding his reflection. And in that moment, as I watched him struggle to answer the final question, I realized something. For all his power, for all his influence, Sean Diddy Combs was just a man haunted by his own choices, trapped by the empire he had built, and crushed under the weight of the secrets he could no longer keep. But was that enough? Was the glimpse of vulnerability I'd seen in that room enough to make a difference? Or would the world move on, leaving the truth behind, forgotten and ignored? I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if Diddy's admissions will lead to justice or if they'll be buried like so many other secrets. But I do know one thing. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And maybe, just maybe, this time it won't be ignored.